Exploration and expansion. The objectives are 1. Discuss how in the 15th century Europeans began to explore the world. And so can summarize how the Portugal, Spain, the Dutch Republic, England reached new economic heights through worldwide trade. Now first, beginning with the motives and means by which European nations began to transcend their traditional navigation borders and moved beyond their normal space to begin to explore the rest of the world. And this really leads to expansion. Now first, Portugal and Spain, then later the Dutch Republic, England, and France all rose to new economic heights through this worldwide trading activity. We see the end of just local trade within Europe itself, and we see an explosion then of trade on unprecedented levels as people become more curious about what actually the East holds for European interests and for the European economy. Now we begin to see hints at this through various travel narratives and travel logs of Europeans. Particularly we see this with Marco Polo, for example. Europeans had long been attracted to Asia, and so Marco Polo, the Italian, while somewhat an air of myth about him, he was a true person and actually did travel to China under the reign of Kublai Khan. And this is really the first kind of opening of the Eastern world to the Western mind in terms of direct contact. But what were the motives? What was the driving force for this new approach versus what existed during the medieval and early Renaissance period? We began to see economic motives loom in the European expansion. It's really about the economic motives. Yes, there's an air of wanting exploration and adventure and glory, but really the engine of this exploration is money. Now, what the East had long been exporting to the West was largely spices. Spices were needed in Europe for several reasons. 1, to preserve the food, to add flavor, and they were very expensive because of the distance that they're traveling. I mean, remember, we're talking about a culture that does not have a refrigerator, so this meat is largely being dried, cured, hung, out to dry. Sometimes it could get kind of rancid, and so the spices are really important for the flavoring of the meat, and sometimes even masking the nasty flavor of bad meat, because meat is expensive and you're going to eat it. So spices were really important, but we have to remember that most elite people are going to be consuming meat, not poor people. Poor people are largely eating dairy, drinking beer, eating bread. That's it. But the elite are eating meat. And so it was important. It was expensive, but it was shipped through various mediums throughout the Middle East and India, all the way from the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. And so this is how far these spices are traveling, and they're important to the European economy. But there were others who really desired to explore for other reasons, particularly in the Catholic faith and in Christianity in general. There's a large impetus toward converting others to the faith. We see this within Christ Jesus and his push for disciple making, that he sends them through the Great Commission to spread the gospel to other nations. And so this becomes a major drive as Europeans discover the method and means by which to travel to distant lands to people who had never heard the name Jesus or Christianity or Catholicism before. Now, others sought grandeur, glory, adventure to a lesser extent, though a major driving force. But all of these together seem to be the main driving factors for the explosion of exploration and trade out of Europe. And so we might glibly say, in a kind of catchy tune and phrase, God, gold, and glory. God, gold, and glory are the three major chief motives for European expansion. Now, Europeans had also reached a level of technology that enabled them to make regular series of voyages beyond Europe. And these technological advances had been put to use for a while by fishermen, whom ignorantly, not to their own fault, were getting quite close to northern Europe in pursuit of better fishing grounds. So inevitably we're going to see that the technology enabled the people with the motives to travel, to explore beyond the normal Western European borderlands. And so we have the motives and means at this point then. Now, it really takes the drive and push of people with money first, because really finances are going to be more like trips to the moon economically, right? So sending these voyages to distant lands is probably about the price tag that it takes for us to send someone to the moon. Expensive, no doubt. But there seems to be an economic motive as well as just the genuine desire for exploration. And we see this initially in the Portuguese trading empire. Portugal took the lead in European expansion. It was really under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator, here depicted, that we see the initial attempts to explore beyond what was normally deemed safe. And he really wants to find a method or means by which to get to the east. And so they begin to probe down southward along the western coast of Africa. Now, what's odd to us, knowing what the world is like, no one knew that Africa was so large. People believed that there was nothing beneath the Sahara Desert, and that if you could get around that bottom portion, then you could navigate to the Indian Ocean and to Asia in general. No one knew that there was an entire sub-Saharan portion of Africa. And so, to their surprise, they'll inevitably find how large it is. The Portuguese sea captains heard reports of a route to India around the southern tip of Africa, and so they begin to probe deeper and deeper along the coast. It's really Vasco da Gama who went around the Cape and cut across the Indian Ocean to the coast of India. He's largely responsible for making this possible. But an odd thing occurs for the European. Suddenly they're thrust into a context that makes them completely different than everyone else around them. They are less technologically advanced than the Chinese, and they aren't sure what to do about this. Their tiny ships are dwarfed by massive Chinese ships. The junk, which is huge and massive, and the tiny caravels and tiny cargo ships are insects in its sight, I suppose. And so they're really not that advanced technologically, and in fact they get laughed at in India. But regardless of this interaction, they come back to Europe with a cargo full of spices. And despite its expense, it was much, much, much cheaper than having to pay for the spices through various middlemen from Southeast Asia all the way to Europe. So this whets the palate of Europe to begin to push for greater exploration. So the Portuguese fleets inevitably push into the Indian Ocean, destroy the Muslim shipping routes and shipping network that had already existed there, and inevitably gained complete control of the spice trade. And this tends to be the pattern we'll see with Europe. As they push into new markets, they destroy intentionally the indigenous market that exists there for the sake of their own expansion economically throughout the globe. Now, the Portuguese then began to range more widely in search of the source of the spice trade. Remember, they've hit India, but the spices aren't ultimately from India themselves. Now, eventually, they do discover Southeast Asia. They discover a Melaka on the Malay Peninsula. And from Melaka, the Portuguese expeditions to China, to the Spice Islands in general. And here we end up seeing the kind of opening of Asia to European interests. Now, it was ultimately due to their seamanship, guns, and ship technology that the Portuguese dominated the spice trade and dominated the eastern market. And so we see this swift expansion and conquest from that initial contact. And this was all driven by these three factors: God, gold, and glory. Now, the voyage to the Americas was born out of the same desire as going around Africa to get to India and to get to spice trade. Now, the Spanish sought to reach in the Indian Ocean and the spice trade by sailing westward across the Atlantic and eventually reaching it. Now, I have to dispel a myth first. No educated person in the world believed that the earth was flat. And I'll say it again. No one believed that the earth was flat. If any teacher told you that, then they haven't done their homework. This is a myth that's been propagated about this time and about the ignorance of people. In fact, it was Christopher Columbus's biographers whom later wanted to lift up and to elevate his accomplishments. They exaggerated the ignorance of the people such that they claimed that everyone believed the earth was flat, and he proved to them that the earth was round. In fact, we know for sure that people believed that the earth was a globe. Even as far back as the medieval period, people knew that it was a globe. Even the scripture itself tells you that it is a globe. And we see pictures of medieval kings holding a globe in their hand with a cross on top, the world and the Christian world. And so this wasn't something. Christopher Columbus did not discover that the earth was circular. He did not. He was not frightened that he would fall off the edge of the earth. Most people did not think that there was even a possibility of falling off the edge of the earth. The question was whether the ocean could be traversed because it was so far. Now, Christopher Columbus estimated that it was doable. It was possible to cross that ocean. Now, Christopher Columbus then sought to head westward to reach the Far East. Not as revolutionary idea as you might guess, but it certainly was revolutionary in the sense of attempting it, wanting to do it. And as I said, educated Europeans knew that the world was round, no question. But here's what's unique. Christopher Columbus believed that India was only 2,000 miles across the Atlantic. Now, what he didn't know was that there was an entire continent in between Asia and Europe. He didn't know that there was North America and South America. But he ends up being close to right. It wasn't 2,000 miles across the Atlantic. In fact, there was a body of land 4,000 miles in actuality, and much, much further to India. So he ends up then plowing through the distance, and he's afraid, no doubt. He's not afraid he's going to fall off the edge of the earth. He's afraid that he's going to run out of supplies, that they're going to not hit land. I mean, this is a big ocean, and you have to remember you're using this somewhat primitive to us technologies that allowed them to reach those distances. Now, this was only possible with the support and funding by the Spanish throne, by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. And it really was in 1492 that he was able to make this happen. He reached the Americas, where he explored the coastline of Cuba and the island of Hispaniola. Now, he did not reach mainland North America. He never reached it, in fact. He believed that he had reached the Indies. He believed that he had reached India. He didn't know that he was in a new place. He believed he had hit islands in the Far East. And therefore, when he met the indigenous people there, he called them Indians. Why? Because he believed he was in India. Now, the tragedy of all this is that inevitably, through various expeditions, he explores the islands, trying to find a passage to India itself, which he doesn't recognize that it's a different continent itself. He inevitably dies, believing that he has reached India. It's not until after he dies that people discover that this is a new continent. So this was a major benefit and boon for European economic interests. In fact, way more beneficial than the opening of India, because now you have an entire new market system, both South America and North America, that can be manipulated for economic gain in Europe. Now, ultimately, we have a competition issue, though, that Spain and Portugal are clashing over the economic benefits of manipulating these markets in the rest of the world. So Spain and Portugal resolved their concerns over exploration and competition with an imaginary line that they divided the sphere of the globe around, and they called this a sphere of influence during the Treaty of Tordesillas. This was in 1494, at least the second version of it. And this gave Portugal control over its routes in Africa and gave Spain rights in almost all of the Americas. So to zoom in here a little bit, in the original treaty in 1493, they argued that since Spain had discovered that Western Hemisphere, and had discovered these new continents, that they could control this. Whereas they would leave the Portuguese to Africa and to the Indian Ocean trade network. However, they didn't recognize that at that signing there had already been expeditions to settle a portion of South America, which will later become Brazil. And so the lines were redrawn in 1494. And so that's why you end up with a Brazil that speaks Portuguese today, and the rest of South America and Central America speaking Spanish, just so you guys understand linguistically how that came about. And so now we see the attempts to manipulate these new markets for European gain. Now, inevitably, this kicks off a race for the Americas as people send explorers and settlers to really dominate that European market in those regions. Government-sponsored explorers from many countries joined the race to the Americas. John Cabot's a perfect example of this, a Venetian seaman who explored for New England and the New England coastline of Americas for England. And we'll inevitably see that these territories will be seized for England economic interests. We'll also see other people emerge. The Florentine Amerigo Vespucci, for example, along with several voyages, wrote letters describing the lands he saw continentally, and inevitably he discovered the mainland of this new world that was later named after him, America, after this Amerigo Vespucci. So we see this explosion of exploration in North America. But really, we need to talk about the Spanish Empire that began to emerge in the territory. Spanish conquerors of America, known as conquistadors, began to explore and look for gold and for other natural resources that could really bolster the Spanish market and Spanish economy. And it was in 1550 that the Spanish gained control of northern Mexico by Hernán Cortés. And Hernán Cortés really seizes the Aztec territories in northern Mexico, and they find tons of gold. Francisco Pizarro, equally so, led expeditions in South America, taking the Incan Empire, and also finding great wealth. And so Spain gets a huge infusion of wealth and gold and natural resources that bolster their economy. And we have to remember that this also bolsters then these nations' economic output and affects their relationship with other European countries. Spain all of a sudden has a lot of spending money, has a lot of cash to build up new trade networks, ships, and military infrastructure, all sorts of things. Now, the Portuguese took Brazil, right, and they located on the other side of the line of demarcation. But it was ultimately Queen Isabella who declared that the Indians were her subjects and granted the Spanish the right to use these people as laborers. So catch this, these people had been living in this territory, independent of European interests, but by Europeans claiming the entire territory. They then decided that these indigenous peoples were their subjects, and their subjects, however different, however odd, could then be used and manipulated for their economic interests because they're their servants now. And so this is what Queen Isabella declares. But there is a flip side to this as well. It gave some element of rights to the indigenous Native American. Now, the Native Americans were used inevitably on sugar plantations and in gold and silver mines. And however different here, for example, Aztecs and their religious rituals of heart sacrifice and human sacrifice in general, we see a attempt at using indigenous people for their economic need, for their economic engine that they're building in the Americas. Now, this is going to be problematic, particularly for the sugar plantations. Why? Because these people know the territory, and it's easy for them to run off. We're having a problem in the Americas because disease from Europe is running rampant and killing people. And that's the biggest problem. With little natural resistance to European diseases, the native peoples were ravaged by smallpox, measles, typhus. We see a dramatic decrease in the Native American populations. For example, the people of Hispaniola, there were, it's estimated, 250,000 people, and they're reduced to 500. Or in Mexico, 100 years after the initial contact, you went from 25 million to 1 million. And this is not people walking around intentionally trying to kill the Native Americans. This is coming as a result of the spread of infectious diseases that Europeans had built up immunity to. And so what ends up occurring is through initial contact, disease is spreading throughout North America, independent of European contact beyond the initial exposure. That Native Americans are spreading it to other Native Americans, just like any other infectious disease. And so, less so the willing desire to kill the Native Americans, and more so the natural consequences of exposing a people to new diseases. This is what inevitably occurs, and what leads to a dramatic decline in the population. It doesn't mean that they were going to treat them nicely in any sense. No. Or at least from an economic perspective, there will be a drive by the Catholics to convert these people and to make them Christians. Native American social and political structures were really torn apart and replaced by European systems of religion, language, culture, and government. They were seen as savages that needed to be civilized, educated, Christianized, westernized. And that's inevitably what we see, the outlawing of their indigenous religions, the outlawing of them speaking their own language and being required to speak Spanish, the eradication of their indigenous culture, the establishment of new political government. This is what emerges in Spain, for example. And that's why you end up with a huge population of Native Americans that speak Spanish. right? Because this is, of course, not their indigenous language whatsoever. But several outcomes occur beyond the spread of disease and the killing of indigenous peoples. This wasn't the only impact from this contact. There was an economic impact, and certainly a competition that emerged from as a result of this. So wherever they went, Europeans sought gold and silver. This was a major issue for them. The European economies are driven by fine bullion, right? The fine metals. And so, of course, they're inevitably going to be searching for gold and silver for that kind of economic currency. But the extensive exchange of plants and animals between the New World and the Old World really led to an explosion of new interactions known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is a very, very, very important concept as a consequence of the European interaction between these other markets and these other people groups. We see that it transformed economic activity in both worlds as new goods are being taken from the old world to the new world and from the new world to the old world. So, for example, a popular item that gets pushed from the new world to the old world would be potatoes, for example. Another item that goes from the old world to the new world would be horses, for example, or even diseases, right? We can talk about diseases in the Columbian Exchange. Obviously, the European brings smallpox and typhus, but the European gets exposed to syphilis, which hadn't existed in Europe prior to this. So while there are obviously positives and negatives, we end up seeing a tighter world, a closer world, a more integrated network rather than isolated pockets. Now, will there be isolated pockets? Of course there will be. But we see then this meshing together economically and socially as Europe had exploded out of Europe and had begun this exchange with other territories. Now, really, by the end of the 16th century, several new European rivals had entered the scene for the Eastern trade. This can, of course, be exemplified in Ferdinand Magellan, whom discovered the Philippines, and sought the exploration of all sorts of new territories that hadn't been discovered to this point. And so new territory and the base of Spanish operations was established, and we really start seeing the melting away of that line of demarcation as people are just exploding all over the place. It's not going to be a just Spanish and Portuguese game. And really, by the beginning of the 17th century, the 1600s, an English fleet landed on northwest coast of India and established trade relations there in India, which will inevitably become a kingdom and economic, really a very important economic center for England in the long run. The Dutch founded new colonies along the Hudson River Valley in North America, and this is going to be a very important establishment for economic gain for the Dutch. And so we see all of these European nations setting down roots in different territories. During the 1600s, the French also colonized part of what is now Canada and Louisiana. English settlers were founding Virginia and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The English seized, inevitably, the Dutch land, which was called New Netherlands, and renamed it New York. So, of course, what we're seeing is, in addition to expansion, we're seeing the rise of two supergiants, the French and the English. And they're going to compete with each other. All of these people are going to be competing with each other, just like any other market-driven competition. And so the English are really going to be competing with the Dutch and seizing territories in conflict. Now, what's driving a lot of this economic activity are certain economic philosophies, particularly the idea of colonialism and the idea of mercantilism. And so really what was sat behind this whole context was that many trading posts and colonies in the Americas and the East were needed for economic benefit. Trade was central to the engine of the European market activities. And the answer to this trade was colonization, the establishment of colonies. Now, a colony is a settlement of people living in a new territory linked with the parent country by trade and direct government control. And we see then a relationship in which often enough the colony would provide raw resources for the parent country, and the parent country, producing what they are producing, would send that back to the colony to sell their goods. And this will be a major cornerstone to future colonialism. So, for example, we'll see in North America that people are going to want tobacco. Inevitably, they're going to use tobacco as a major selling point. And so what's going to happen is that the colonies are going to be a major source of raw resources to send back to the European market. So what we end up seeing is an increase in international trade as goods are traversing the oceans to be sold. Now, the other issue here is mercantilism, which is a set of principles that dominated economic thought in the 17th century. The prosperity of a nation depended on large supply of bullion, or Greek, that is gold and silver. So what we end up seeing is that people are hoarding and collecting lots of gold and silver, and this really becomes the driving force for wealth. How much gold, how much silver, and through this then trade, because gold and silver are going to be those major items of trade rather than a barter system or something like that. Now, inevitably, one of the other ideas that crops up is the balance of trade. The idea of the difference in value between what a nation imports and what it exports. Really, at the heart of it, we end up seeing that most European nations want to export more than they import. They want to sell more than they buy, which is, on a whole, a good balance of trade for economic gain. And so these are really the driving economic theories they're pushing the European nations into this global market. Now, the objectives were: 1, discuss how in the 15th century Europeans began to explore the world, and 2nd, summarize how Portugal, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and England reached new economic heights through worldwide trade.